Hello everyone, welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to be looking at a way to construct an adaptive return feed for your remote guest. So that's basically a way to look at whatever is being sent out in the program feed, deconstructing that, and rebuilding it in a way that's optimized for a specific return guest. But before we get there, I'd like to invite everyone, please, if you have any feedback, any questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments below. Also, if you would like to join us live on air, we've posted a URL in the show notes, and it's up here on screen, where you can basically click and join us here live on air for one-to-one discussion about anything streaming, but ideally related to the topic at hand. So let's get into it then. One of the things that we have heard a lot from people as they've done more productions with remote guests is that sometimes the guests, especially ones that are not broadcast savvy, haven't been in this space before, it's very disconcerting for them to see themselves in a video return, but out of time with themselves, out of sync. We've all become very accustomed to sort of the Zoom way where it shows us in a window, but that window is generated locally and everybody else is coming remotely. And instead now, because this is a feed from a studio, that latency from the round trip from that guest coming back to them causes that type of delay. And as I said, that can be disconcerting for some people. So what we wanted to do in this show was we wanted to look at a way we could deconstruct whatever is in program and rebuild it with three things in mind. The first is that the guests will never see themselves. The second is that the guest will always see the other participants they may be on air with. So that's a host and other guest. But the third thing is they won't ever see anybody in their return feed twice. So you won't see, one of your co-guests in a little bar below and another one in the video that's coming back. So those are the three criteria we set up in designing a script that will let us do this. So let's take a look at the basic flow for what we're going to be doing here. We have a vMix session set up, and we set up multiple guests here and a host. So those are the inputs we have right across the top. And for this example that we're putting together here, we are going to be guest one. And so we are going to be building the feed that will come back to us as guest one. So in addition to just video that could be coming in from other guests and the host, you could have slides, you could have other video sources, as well as what we have set up here, many different types of multi-box shots, which is very common, especially when you're dealing with multiple guests and multiple remote guests. You'll end up breaking them up into different little multi-box shots. So this is the way we've laid this all out. But the one that's really interesting is this little box on the end, because this is the input that we're going to be using to build the return video that we'll be sending back to us over here as guest one. And so the way we do that is we have different components to this input set up as layers that we will populate and turn on and turn off as needed. So the first one, if we zoom in on this, is across the bottom of this screen. We are going to have guests that will all be coming up. So if you see here, let's see if we can get this up full screen here, this input. So the what we have along that would be all of our other guests here. Let me see, let me just pop this over here in the preview so we can keep going. So we have all of the guest layers that we have here. So we have the three other guests, guest 2, 3, and 4, and we have the host here as well. And so that's one layer of this multi-layer input. The second is we have a main video. So this main video could be any source that you want. And this will be what we'll send back if we don't have to do a lot of manipulation. It could be, the actual video feed that's in program. That may be what we put here. But if we deconstruct this, we may end up having to do a few other things, which could mean we need to put up multiple boxes. So in that case, instead of having one main video return, we could actually split it up and have multiple video returns. So what we're doing in this process is we are analyzing and rebuilding using this general template to send this video feedback. So let's actually look at this in action. So what we have now is on the screen here, if we have a multi-box shot, I think, of the two, this is, let me clear this out so we can sort of start fresh here. So this is what we have coming out of our vMix outputs. This is the program feed that's being sent out to the audience. Now, if I wanted to do a return with this feed, it would be pretty straightforward. What I'd end up doing is I'd just send that feedback. It's just the guest feed. But the thing I would do in addition is I would recognize that this is one of the guests, and I would take them out of this lower band with my other co-guests. So again, this is I want to make sure you don't see the same person twice. And this would be a very comfortable feed for most people that would be watching. But say instead, I had myself in this feed. Now this is, I'm here, and so what am I going to send back? So what we do in this case is we'll actually send the host back, because we figure if you are on air, full screen, in all likelihood, you are talking with somebody in the studio, and it's that type of back and forth that you'd have. And so we set this up so dynamically this would be how your return would be adjusted. And again, this is very logical, because now you're seeing the 4 other people you're having this conversation with, the hosts and the other 3 guests, and that's all here. But say it's a little more complicated. Say what we actually have here is something like this, where you're there and you're talking about a video. So if we have that as our setup, what we would do is we would recognize that you were in it, take you out, deconstruct this to pull out the video and make that video full screen, and we'd show all your other guests, fellow guests, and the host in this. So all of this is being done dynamically in our scripting. So if I were to take this again, where I have a 2-box shot, very, very common, what we would do in this case with the script is we'd recognize that the other was a full, it could be put in as a full guest shot, and we'd show them and pull them out from the bottom. And this would also work for something like a 2-box. So let me see. So if I have this here with a multi-box shot, when I do this, it would recognize that there were 2 other guests with me and pull those guests in as the upper bars here, and below that would be the other 2, the other co-guest and the host. So all of this here, as we put this together, is basically happening just with dynamic flow. So everything that we put in program, with this running in the background, would just pop up and have an alternative view that we could send back to each one of the guests. So hopefully this makes it clearer what we're doing, because what I'd like to do now is jump into the script that we actually use to do this. And this is probably going to be the biggest script that we've gone through. So I'll cover things more in logical blocks, and you'll be able to sort of jump away and take care of learning the details as we go on. So let me jump over to the scripting over here. Do this here. Let's see if we can put this up on a single screen here. There we go. So, as I said, this is a pretty hefty script. So let's pop back to the top, and we'll start to go through it. So what we want to do first is really identify all of the different elements that we're going to be manipulating in the script. And to be able to do all that, we need a ton of variables. So at the top, we have everything for what's the inputs for a program, what are the inputs for my fellow guest and for the host. So those things are all in there. We have the inputs that we're going to be manipulating. So when we deconstruct the program output, we need to know what are all the inputs we're deconstructing and what do we want to do with that. So everything for if we're talking about content, if we're talking about other people, and then just keys that we use as temporary placeholders, because sometimes some of the APIs need an input key and some of them will need an input number, and we just need to be able to pop back and forth. So we use a few temporary placeholders for doing these types of transformations, and we declare all this out in the beginning. Bunches of counters we use for looping, the input numbers, the specific ones we'd be using to make the API calls, and then all the XML components that we have here. So these would be all the things as we pull an input out, we need the XML for that to deconstruct it and work with it. So when we have all of those elements sort of defined, then we're going to actually start doing the processing around that. So let me just very quickly, before we get into this next piece, I would like to say we have James from Arkansas. We have Peter from Berlin. Peter, James, thank you very much. We have Hakan from Sweden. So Hakan, thank you. And we have Xavier with us from Nigeria. So Xavier, thank you. I haven't seen you pop up before, so if this is your first time on the show, thank you very much for joining. So, okay, so let's jump back into the programming logic that we have with this. So, as usual, we start by loading the XML module that is associated with vMix, and this is the full descriptor of vMix, of the vMix session, dynamically updated. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take and load in basically find in that XML the XML for each one of the guests. So we'll know exactly what their input is. And we've done this by name. So we've used guest-0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and host as the names of the inputs that we have these guests in. And what we're doing here is we are finding the XML with an XPath that's basically very specific. Find the XML, any XML in the vMix which actually has this title. And this is going to point us specifically, create a node specifically for the input with that title. And then from there, we're just going to pull the keys, which give us a unique identifier for each one of the inputs. And we're doing that for all of the guest inputs here. And we're doing that as well for the host input, which we just named host. So this whole first part is really about identifying the things we're going to manipulate. Now the second part is we're going to start looking at what's in the program output, because that's what we're going to have to deconstruct to figure out what to do. So the first thing is we find out what's in vMix active. In the XML, vMix active stores the input number of the input that's in program. When we find that, we'll pull this out and get an XML node, which will let us know all the details. Now we know the input. We use the input to get the detail about that input. And then we also get the key value from there, which gives us a way to access it directly. And from there, we're pulling out, or we're attempting to pull out, everything in the program, the input that's going out the program, that has overlay. So what that is doing is it's looking to say, how many layers do I have inside of my program output? And so what we're checking right after that is, what are the total number of layers? And we have two alternatives. One is there are no layers, in which case we're just dealing with a single input, and we process that one way. The other case is there are layers, and we need to pull those apart to figure out what we'd want to rebuild. So As we do this, we basically come back and say, if it's less than or equal to 0, which means there are no layers, then we're actually doing something that's fairly straightforward. We are going and saying, if in the program input, if one of those layers is guest 2, 3, 4, or 5, 2, 3, 4 are the host, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we turn off that overlay if they are not there, and turn on that overlay if they are not there, and turn it off if they are, because this is the I only want to see one copy. So if in that video return that we have, guest 3 is there, we want to make sure that we turn them off in that little bar of guests that we have going across the bottom, because we'll see them in the return video. And the same for all of them. Then what we're going to do here is, if it is guest 1 that's in the video. So remember, we're guest 1 in this scenario. So if this is a video of me, we don't want to send that back. So what we will do instead is we'll turn on the appropriate output. So we're turning off the multi information returns, with the 2 boxes that we had, and we're going to be just using the 1 main box return with all the guest boxes. And when we set all of those up, what we'll be doing is we'll turn around and say, if it's me, what I want to do is show the host in there instead and turn the host off down below. And if it isn't me, if it's another guest that's in there, then we'll just put that out as the program number, and we've turned them off already. So that's where we get where you can see the other guest or the host if based on what we have in program. And that's very simple because there are no layers. So we don't really have to deconstruct anything. We just have to make a decision about what we want to do. Now, if there are layers, we have a bit more that we have to figure out. So the first thing we want to figure out is, okay, we got a lot of layers. Am I as guest 1 in any of those layers? So what we're doing here with that first check is we're basically saying, let's select any node inside of the program, the input that's associated with program out, and that is associated with an overlay called guest 1. And so what this is going to do is basically say, are any of the overlays, give me an input of all the overlays that are guest 1. And if there is nothing there, which is what we do with this next test over here, then we know that guest 1 isn't there. So that simplifies things, because if guest 1 isn't there, then we can pretty much use what's there. We just have to know now if there are other guests in there, we want to pull them out from the bar of guests and the host across the bottom. And that's exactly what we're doing in this segment of code right here. We're basically going through and saying, if guest 2 is there, turn their little box off below. If guest 3, same thing. And we just go through all that and the host. And since guest 1 is not in the program, we know we can just, with those switched off, we can just return whatever the program output is back, and we've already switched off any guests that may be in it. So that's very straightforward because guest 1 is not in it. So that was a pretty straightforward thing we can do. But once guest 1 is in it, now we can't really use that program output at all because it's got guest 1, and as it is, we can't really just take that and do anything with it. So what we have to do is we have to pull the elements out and decide how we're going to rebuild them. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to select the different overlays and basically turn all them on. So we know guest 2, 3, 4, and the host, those overlays now are all turned on. And we're going to start from there, and then we can see what else we need to do. So with those all on, what we're going to do is we're going to see first, is there content in this, or is it just other guests than the host? So by content, I mean, is there a video? Are there slides, images, other things like that? And if there's content, we're going to prioritize that because we already have videos of all the other people. So if there's content, that's what we're going to highlight. And so we first look and say, if there is content, then we will say if the node is not 0, then there's layers with content. And from there, we go, if there's only one piece of content, again, it's a pretty straightforward thing. We'll take that one piece of content out. We will assign that to the main content return, and we'll display all the other guests across the bottom. And that's exactly what we're doing in this block of code that comes next. We're basically setting everything up and saying, okay, put that content program layer into what we return and make sure all the other layers are on. We're good. But if there's more than one piece of content, then we have to find all of them. So if this count is greater than 1, what we're doing is, so in this case, for simplicity, we just said we'll stop at 2, but we could have done things which would loop through more and figured out exactly what to do. So there were different options we could have used. This is the way we set it up here. But it basically will cover the core concept with this. So with this, we find the 2 pieces of content, the first 2 non-guest or host layers that are in this, and we pull those out. And now, using the model of the return, which had the dual displays, where you had 2 content elements that are being displayed, multiple content elements, that's what we're going to be filling in here. So we identify them, set up all the returns correctly, and we set one of these to content 1 program layer and content 2 program layer, which are the 2 layers that we've identified content on. Like I said, we could have been more, but we actually set it up with just those 2. So this means that now we've had everything going out correctly with content. And this is very logical to people. So if I, let me just see if I can switch over to this screen over here. You can see when we have this, let me just pop this up. So when we have this type of thing set up now, this gives us a very clean thing where we've disassembled the content layers and you still see all the guests. So it's for the return viewer, like if I'm looking at this as one of the remote guests, this is much simpler to me than trying to see myself and other content sort of packaged up. This is a very cleanly laid out view of what's going on in the show without having to see the actual program out. So if we switch back to the code over here, this is everything we need for content. But if there are no layers with content, and there are multiple layers, then we need to find, are there layers with other people? And we're doing a very similar thing. We basically ask, and let me just see if I can wrap this here. So this wraps around. So what we're doing here, where we're saying, are there layers with other people? We basically know by the time we've gotten to this statement that if we hit this else, there are no content layers. So we know there are only people layers there, the guest or the host. And so what we're doing is we're saying, create something we call people nodes with all of the inputs in the program layers that do not include guest 1 inputs. So basically I'm saying, if it's not guest 1, give me basically an XML node list of all of those guests. And so we generate that, and then we start again, like we said, we're turning all the guest return layers, those little videos across the bottom, we turn all of those on to get started. And now, if there's only one other person, this is very similar to what we do with content. If there's only one other person, we use the big single box return in the return video, and we plug that person in there, and then we find out who they are, and we shut them off from the bar below. Very, very similar to what we've done all along. If there are multiple people greater than 1, we said, like we did before, we're just going to show 2 in this case. So we do very similar. We get who are these people, get the keys, turn them into input numbers, and from there we're able to, for the 2 people, the first 2 keys, we're able to then go and shut off their return layers below and plug them into the two multiple return layers that we had that we were showing content in before. Now we'll just show the alternate guest in there. And so all of this, again, this is just the same core logic that we're using in multiple ways to set up the return layers and get this reconstructed in a way that makes sense to each of the guests. So, like I said, there's a lot of detail in this code. We're, in this with comments and everything, we're 315 lines in this script. So probably more than I'd want to be able to go through in a live thing where for a line by line approach. But I think I've covered the general flow and logic, and this will be up on GitHub for you to download and play with yourself. So hopefully you'll be able to dig a bit deeper into that. I think the key elements here for everything that we wanted to show is that you have some flexibility with what you send back to guests because you can access the core elements that go to make it up inside of vMix. So in this case, we did this with sort of one particular template in mind. But you could, for instance, do this to change elements based on somebody's language or their ability, like say you had different types of guests on, some of whom may be scientists and others who may be lay people. You may, when you show a slide, turn around and say, I have a corresponding slide for the scientist or the layperson, and create those types of alternate returns based on whatever is being shown inside of your program out. So different use cases that this could apply to, but the core concept of deconstruction and reconstruction, I think, will apply, for lots of different scenarios you may have. So that's everything I wanted to cover, but we also had, so I hope I say your name correctly. I'm sorry if I don't. Apologies. Brulafu from Scotland. So Brulafu, thank you very much for joining us here today. And again, we will be staying after if you have any questions or would like to discuss anything related to what we talked about today, live streaming, production in general. All of that's welcome. And in the post show also, we will be taking callers. So if you would like to join us live for the post show, please, you can just go to the URL we post for that, and that's in the show notes, and all should be good. So, we have a few more people joining. We get this right before the post show. We have Opeyemi from London, and we have Jason. So Jason Klee actually asked a very interesting question here. So Jason, if you can hold on, we'll close up the show and we'll get to that right away in the first thing in the post show. So if you can't join for the post show, thank you all for joining for the main show, and we'll see you next week. If you can join us, that would be great, and I'll see you in a few seconds. Take care, everyone. All right, welcome back to the post show here. So Jason just ended things as we were talking, asking the question about how do you send 4 different views to guests while still having the program out? And that actually is going to be next week's show, but I'll give you a little hint, and it's actually, I just started it in the code. So put this over here. We'll put this in program out. So what we will be doing for this is we'll be creating basically a multi-view, a layered input with each one of these returns split up into corners. And so we'll create 4 different returns. We'll put them into 4 different quadrants of a single input. And we're going to feed that out an output. And we're going to take that into OBS We're going to deconstruct that into 4 different scenes, each of which will have their own NDI output, and we're going to be working with that as the way to handle the returns. And we still can do the audio outs, you know, right from here into each one of those scenes, so each group would get the correct audio they need. So that it was a perfect segue question for what we'll be doing next week, but we're going to go over how we set all that up and do it. But that's how we're going to do it. We're going to do a combined multi-layer with 4 different outputs and deconstruct that inside of OBS to feed that as return videos. So great question. Thank you very much, Jason, for asking that. So Gary, welcome. So he said, so you would have to multiply this code by however many guests you have in order to accommodate each guest. So yes, I mean, I really haven't looked yet at total optimization for this. So there will probably be ways that we could leverage some things in common and set this up. But this would be definitely something that you would need in large part to replicate for each one of the guests. And even though these are fairly hefty scripts, what we think could be a potential way to sort of reduce the burden on vMix is that you have a very lightweight script that just looks, continually running in the background, that looks for something to change in program, if there's something new in program. When it sees something new, then it will call the other script to say, okay, run and refresh everything you need to send back to the remotes. And we think that would make this work pretty well with you know, a higher scale, because it could do this sequentially and make that happen. So this is, you know, real code, so we'd want to, you know, minimize the load. But as the developers here keep telling me, even though there's a lot of lines of code, it's really very lightweight code and there's nothing to worry about. So, you know, and this is, you know, probably me being cautious in a production space, but by and large, multiple lines, you know, many lines do not mean heavy load. So this may just be able to run on its own all the time in the background. So let's see. So James Redmond was saying, most of my clients use Zoom, so we can set up a computer with gallery view, pin that, and send that feed to the guest. So the quick answer is yes, but probably the issue with gallery mode in general terms is that you don't have a user, you know, a viewer's focus directed anywhere. And I know, and probably anybody that's been on Zoom calls, you can have somebody talking, but you're actually fascinated by, you know, somebody else's ugly dog that's walking down the basement steps, you know, and you're like, oh, what's that? And you sort of lose the whole focus of, you know, what you're supposed to be on that conference for. So having control over what you send back to guests, we think is really valuable. So this would be something where if you had multiple guests coming in and they were in a vMix session, like you pinned them and had them set up that way, if you wanted to create some sort of multi-box for that, that would definitely be something you could do. And there would be ways you could handle that, where if it's going back to, you know, one guest or another, you know, you could decide to say, if that guest is active and talking, I want to send them something different than if they're just watching. So you'd have some flexibility there, but I would probably look and say, based on how engaged you want a particular participant to be, you may want to do more than a galley view from something like Zoom. So let's see, what else? So we have the Jesus Full Gospel Assembly. Bert Williams, hello from Trinidad and Tobago. Bert, thank you very much for joining us. Definitely appreciate it. So, you know, hopefully, you know, you're finding ways to use this in, you know, the mission you have down there. So we are hopeful this makes a difference for what you're able to do. So so we have OpenYemi. Yes, there are lots of distractions with the Zoom gallery, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges when you have people that are remote. You lose that immediate engagement that you have when everybody's face to face. So one of the reasons we wanted to have all of the other guests and the hosts visible to you all the time is that we think there's a lot of positive feedback you get from that. If I'm talking and people start making faces or look antsy like they want to say something, those are cues that we'd have with other people in person that when you're remote you don't always have. So having those other views there of all the other guests, I think is really important. You get that sense of connection with what's going on, and you get a lot more of the nonverbal cues that would be lost otherwise. But it's something where that works with a smaller group. Bigger groups, that may not be ideal. I mean, if you had 15 or 20 people, you stop. It becomes more like I'm in my crowd mode almost. I'm not trying to read everybody. I'm just trying to understand the general flow of what's going on around me. So I think we react differently based on the size of the groups we're with. And so this can be something where you may decide to do things differently if you had larger groups, but you still may want to have different returns for different people based on roles or expertise level or other things of interest to them. So it's possible you could even let people select what return they wanted. So that would probably be an interesting show on different ways you could end up doing that, where people could have simpler or more detailed returns and let them pick. So different types of things that could be done with that. But we think that the scripting here will give you the general framework to sort of go wild on your own and say, how do I want to use this? So this is more of a conceptual thing. And like I said, we will cover how to deal with larger groups in the next week's show, where you want multiple returns. But it also, when you think of this opens up a lot more to you when you understand the way you can do layered inputs inside of layered inputs. So theoretically, if I have one input with 10 layers, and I could put 10 of those inputs into another layer, you could conceivably have a layer with 100 inputs. Now, I am not suggesting that that is a rational thing to do, but technically, if you had the horsepower to drive it, you could conceivably do something like that. So that gives you a lot more flexibility than you would have had with just your immediate 10 layers. And that means you could do this thing almost like building blocks. The bottom bar we had with all the other guests, maybe that's something that some people would want to see, other people wouldn't. And you could make that a component that gets switched on and off. So things like that, where you can sort of think about doing much more complex layouts because you're not really limited to just 10 layers. You can compress them and have an input with one block of layers for one element and another input with another block of layers for other elements, and then combine them. So a lot more flexibility here than you'd probably get at first blush, and that's something we didn't do inside this code, but something that you could certainly consider doing for what you're putting together. So want to put out one more call for questions. So OpenYemi said, what is the best route to becoming a broadcast engineer? So that's an interesting question because we talk a lot about technology, but there are multiple sides, I think, to becoming an engineer. I mean, so the first is you need to understand the tools and how you can leverage the tools to create productions. And some of that really is an engineering mindset. As an engineer, you tend to look at a problem and then break it into smaller problems and look at the tools you have available to solve those smaller problems, solve them, and then reassemble it into something bigger. And that's really what we do here every week on the show. We will have an objective. Here's what we want to display on screen, have as a studio feed, have as a return feed. All of those things are really the big problem. And then we sort of break it down to say, okay, what are the different elements of that big problem that I need to solve? I need to find out which guests are in program. I need to find out which returns I want to send back and which inputs I want to light up. All the things we talked about today. So that's sort of the decomposition. And then you look at the tools, whether it's scripting, different types of automation, just assembling something in vMix. That's how you'll get to understand sort of the process. And I think the best way to start is by getting a tool like vMix, challenging yourself to put something together. Not that you have to stream it or do anything. You can just use a local webcam and just say, gee, I want to actually start working with lower thirds and understanding what I can do. I want to work with multiple cameras and understand how I can switch and all the different things. So that will give you sort of the technical chops to do this and a sense of how to break things down and solve problems. But I think the other piece is just look at what's on sort of the major television channels today in terms of how they build programs. And there's a lot of knowledge and sort of that institutional knowledge that's sitting there. So just like if you wanted to make movies, the first thing I tell you is watch a lot of movies, and you'll learn a lot about how people build stories. It's the same thing here. As if you want to be in broadcast engineering, learn the tools, but also learn the art. Understand how people build programs, the types of shots that work, the types of shots that don't, lighting and how lighting can make a difference. There's lots of elements. So really those are the two things. And if there is somebody that you can work with down there, it doesn't have to be a television broadcaster or anything. It can be, it can be somebody that's doing something in a church, where you're located. And they'll take you in because they'd love to have somebody else that could help, and you can learn a lot from them. And I think that's really key. People in this industry are very generous with knowledge. That's been my experience from everybody that I've worked with. So if you go in with sort of an open mind and a willingness to learn, there'll be a lot of people that will definitely share with you. So now I have Axafilm. It says, don't want to change tack, but I have a replay question. How can I find the event description from the selected replay event? Okay, so that is not something I know off the top of my head. So I will, if you could, so this will be in the live replay. If you could actually just send that to me, John at streamingalchemy.tv. Send that question to me, and we'll definitely take a look at that. I'd have to see how much information is in the XML that we could find with that, and from there we'd need to see how quickly it's refreshed, because sometimes certain things aren't refreshed as often as others. So we'd have to make sure that information was not just available, but also available quickly enough. But just send that as an email, and we'll definitely take a look at it. So Axa, thank you for the question. Definitely appreciate it. So, all right. So I think we've probably covered everything we like. So thank you, everybody, for hanging around for the post show. And you already have a hint of what we're going to be doing next week. So I look forward to seeing all of you then. So have a great week, everyone, and enjoy your weekend. Take care. Bye.